But, in this time when it's hard to engage with each other in person, it's more important than ever that we stay connected with each other and for WHYY to stay connected with you. So a little housekeeping first. Many of you submitted questions in advance, which I will be asking throughout our conversation today. But you can also ask questions in the Q&A section of the chat. And we will be occasionally asking you questions in the poll section of the chat as well. Our discussion today will be about 35 minutes and followed by 15 minutes with your questions at the end. But again, we will be addressing many of those questions throughout our conversation. So let's get started. Avi, you want to get us started?
Sure.
Why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your beat and also where you are right now.
I'm in my house in South Philadelphia. So I'm the education reporter at WHYY and also for a project called Keystone Crossroads, which is basically a collaboration of public radio stations across the state of Pennsylvania. And so I wear a couple of hats. When I'm sort of working exclusively for WHYY, I am focusing on Philadelphia schools or schools in the Philadelphia region. Keystone Crossroads is a project that WHYY leads, but it broadcasts around the state. So when I'm doing Keystone Crossroads stories, they tend to have statewide applicability or be about statewide issues. So I'm really happy to be with everyone today. Obviously, when we do these panels, it's really nice to see and really be with everyone. But I'm really grateful that we're able to at least reproduce some of that because that's something that WHYY does really well is these events. So I want to give a shout out to Christine and Emily and everybody who's helped put this together. Before I kick it over, I just want to humble myself a little bit to say that, I think for folks who are on here who are parents and teachers, you have much more of at least a depth of knowledge about how this is working right now because you're doing it every day. And it's so interesting to see, especially for parents who don't get to see what the education experience looks like on a day-to-day basis. Now they at least get a glimpse into what it kind of looks like. And so if you're one of those parents, I think you have a really great understanding that even we don't have that we're trying to gather. So I just want to make sure that I kind of defer on some level when we talk about this to the expertise of parents who are watching this day in and day out.
Thank you, Avi. And so true. So many people impacted and parents had a lot to say in their questions and we look forward to this conversation. Dale?
Well, hi, I'm Dale Mezzacappa, and I work at the Philadelphia Public School Notebook, which is a publication that's been around a very long time, both in print and online, that has the mission of covering the Philadelphia School District. I've been at the Notebook for about 12 years. Before that, I worked for the Inquirer, and I covered the Philadelphia School District for a good deal of the time I was there. So I've written about Philadelphia schools for a very long time, but like Avi, I defer to the people who are on this call because we depend on you in any circumstances to share your stories in order for us to do our jobs. And so I appreciate being asked to be on this forum, and I hope that we can exchange information in a way that will help everybody.
Thank you, Dale. And Dale and I go way back. We used to be at the Inquirer together, and here I am at WHYY. And one of the reasons I came here was about the opportunity to engage with people every single day. So let me get started with a kind of a big question. With the pandemic, everything changed overnight, and suddenly everyone had to adapt to the unknown. In fact, one of our questioners wondered if the fabric of education was being torn apart. So can the two of you talk for a minute about what you've observed and where your focus as reporters shifted overnight? Avi, you want to get us started?
Yeah, so the first overnight shift, I think, was just trying to stay on top of all of the updates. So there were updates about where students could get food, updates about whether classes were being held, updates about whether teachers were allowed to hold classes or give instruction. So I think the first wave of this was just trying to be a conduit for the information coming from the higher ups, the state or the district, to the people who were being affected, because it's rare that there are any policy changes that we cover that affect basically literally every student and parent. But that's what was happening here. So that's where the focus was initially. Since then, I think it's split into a couple of main areas. One is trying to look at what the financial fallout of all of this is going to be for schools of all stripes. And the second is trying to understand a little bit better what this experience of doing virtual education is really like for teachers, for parents, for students. And that touches on the day-to-day experience of the classroom, however you want to define what the classroom is right now, but also about sort of the day-to-day experience around other things that school would normally provide, like social support, food, planning for college, all those other types of things. So I think that's basically where it's breaking down for me right now.
Mm-hmm. Dale?
Yeah, well, Avi spoke well about the transition. And as we're moving more into it, I think I'd like to emphasize the issue of along the lines of everything is changing. And I think two things come out to me. One is the idea that somehow education, we're looking at education completely differently. It's always been considered, kids go to school, they sit in a classroom, and what they learn there is education, and everything else is something different.
Yeah.
Now I think we're realizing that everything is education. This effort to provide it virtually has reinforced a whole lot of things that we have been reporting on in one way or another before, one of which Avi touched on, economics and fiscal issues. And it's become very clear during this pandemic and the circumstances that everyone in the state is now in, the inequality that defines education in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and in the country for that matter, is just being emphasized in ways that we never could have imagined otherwise by this whole pandemic. And then the other thing that's happening is trying to figure out what return to normalcy means and what it's going to look like, both in a logistical sense, with sanitizers and masks and, social distancing, but also in a bigger sense, a meta sense, of looking at education, and not simply in the looking at technology and, okay, kids can use computers and, that's another way of learning, but in a real deeper sense of what education really means. And so it will be very interesting to see how this, what happens come September in many different ways.
Well, I think let's talk about two things. One is about inequities, as you mentioned, Dale. You both have done stories on things like how schools weren't initially allowed to track attendance or participation because not all students had, laptops. Students didn't have connectivity. We know that a lot of laptops were distributed to students, and then teachers overnight had to figure out how to, master online learning, let alone stay connected to students. So talk a little bit about more of those inequities that I think everyone has known has existed for a long time. How are those being resolved, or at least dealt with now? Obviously not resolved, but dealt with at this moment. Dale?
Sure. Well, the first thing was that the school district had to get Chromebooks to every student in the district, which was a monumental task and expensive. And they did that pretty much. And they weren't the only school district that did this. Other schools, New York did it. Los Angeles did it. They just distributed Chromebooks to everyone. Then but not everyone had, as was also pointed out, internet connectivity. And there was a that was highlighted, and it still hasn't been solved. There's going to be a committee meeting right after this at 5 o'clock, in which Superintendent Height is going to be reporting on things like participation and so on. But there's a persistent fact that a large portion of the students in Philadelphia do not have access to the internet, or they don't have good enough access. They're still trying to distribute these hotspots. And that, to me, that whole thing raises a bigger issue about internet connectivity in general, and how it is, not treated as a utility, which a lot of people have said it should be. Instead, it's something that's expensive and not universally available. And Philadelphia, by far, is not the only place that's affected by this. So that's one thing about inequality. The other thing about inequality is the simple resources at the disposal of school districts. Avi has done more reporting in the suburbs, but I've done a little. And, wealthier districts right on the fringes of Philadelphia were able to, they already have what is known in the district or in education circles as one-on-one, which means one computer per student. And so they could pretty much pick up where they left off. The teachers were familiar with the technology already. The students were familiar with the technology. And they were able to do a whole lot of start holding classes, having assignments, exchanging, giving out assignments. And they were able to do it with not a whole lot of interruption. It took Philadelphia a month or more, just to get all the pieces in place, where it got to a point where it felt like it could fairly grade students, hold into account as far as attendance and things like that, whereas other school districts started doing that right from the beginning. And then, of course, the other issue has to do with special needs students and students who don't speak English. And are they getting the services that they are used to and that they need to have? And so that's another area where this inequality has really become more obvious than it ever has been.
Yeah, and I think sort of on another plane of that, but sort of connected to the same issue, is that there are going to be families, we know, who the child has help from a parent or two parents at home to navigate maybe getting online or submitting assignments online or whatever the issue may be, or just help with work. And then there are students whose parents who either are transient, or their parents are essential personnel, or just not able to help them in the same ways. And that always existed. But one interesting thing that a teacher said to me was that this has made her colleagues think more about that, because all of school now is happening in the home, right? So you have to be more conscious of what is that home environment like. And that was, like I said, it's not a new issue, but it's sort of like the technology thing, where it's brought something that was already existing into starker relief. And I think spinning this forward, the way inequality may play out is that all the predictions that we've seen suggest that school districts where property values are lower and tend to be where incomes are lower are more reliant on state aid. And the predictions are that those types of districts will take a bigger financial hit moving forward, because state aid is tied to things like income tax, sales tax, things that are more deeply affected by this economic downturn, whereas local revenue is more linked to property values, which tends to be more stable. So, that type of inequality is going to rear itself in year 1, 2, 3 post-pandemic.
Well, Avi, this economic tsunami is going to affect everyone, right?
Yeah.
The school district in Philadelphia is projecting, I think, a $1 billion deficit by 2025. Suburban schools also, I think, will be struggling as well. And, I think we're probably looking at tax revenue potentially going up. What's the school? I know the school district released a report today, I think, wasn't it, about some budgetary type things?
Yeah.
What do you foresee in terms of, how this will have this economic impact will impact teacher furloughs potentially. There's a contract being negotiated right now. What are
Yeah.
you seeing?
I think it's so. I'll speak in broad terms because the specifics will be dictated a little bit by the district and also by whatever happens with federal stimulus and also the pace of the economic recovery. So all these things are factors. But I think it's safe to say that basically every district is going to be looking at some sort of hole to fill. How do you fill that? You can raise taxes locally. Most districts can. Philadelphia, for reasons we probably shouldn't totally get into here, actually can't do that on its own. but most school districts are able to raise their own property taxes. The other things you can do is basically cut costs. The biggest cost for, I think it's fair to say, every single school district is personnel. So that means those are real people. Say personnel makes it sound so impersonal, but that's teachers, that's nurses, that's counselors, that's cafeteria staff. I mean, that's, I think, ultimately where this is heading. I mean, I think we know that we're coming toward a juncture of some pain. We just don't quite know the extent of it and exactly what it's going to look like. And I just want to circle back to something I said earlier, which is, for school districts that have a stronger property tax base, they'll be able to draw on that potentially, assuming that their constituents are willing to agree to tax increases. But, they'll be able to draw on that. Lots of poorer school districts won't. And so they'll be more at the mercy of whatever happens at the state level. And so you'll probably, if the last recession is any indication, see deeper cuts in those school districts. That's just what the history tells us. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but that's the precedent that's been set by past recessions.
The wealthier districts obviously do not rely on state aid to the extent that the poorer districts do. So a cut in state aid is not going to affect them as much.
Right.
And there's still a lot that's still up in the air. And there's a lot of politics happening in Harrisburg in terms of what to do, how to treat the stimulus money. There's some stimulus money that's going directly to, that is designated specifically for school districts and specifically for dealing with expenses relating to the coronavirus. But the past recession, started in 2008, when there was a stimulus that came to Pennsylvania, what happened then was that the governor at the time, who was Tom Corbett, the stimulus money was essentially, a little bit happened under Rendell as well, but it was used essentially to replace the state aid instead of supplement it. The supplement, not supplant, which is a technical term, but what it means is, does the state aid, the federal aid was meant to help and not to replace the state aid. But the way the state budget is structured, education spending is one of the largest items in the state budget, but it's also one of the more flexible ones. Yeah. Other things the state can't cut, like the pensions and a lot of other expenses it has. So it tends to play around with the state aid to education. And the last time, districts lost $1 billion and Philly absorbed a quarter of that loss, which was devastating to the school district. And they are trying everything they can now to avoid that again. Because what happened last time is, nurses got laid off and counselors got laid off and teachers, it was terrible. So, but there's a lot of, as we know, a lot of politics is playing on this, a lot of very partisan politics, different views, not only of, when things should reopen, but how much money schools need or should get and how that money should be distributed. And all that is still up in the air. So it's hard to tell what's going to happen.
So what's happening behind the scenes that we're not seeing?
I would just, a lot of lobbying. Basically, like from the school district's level, right? They're just talking to the legislators in Philadelphia, trying to get them to make their case for them, talking to people at the state, trying to, I would say probably at this point, from what I could tell, more like actually just trying to figure out what's going to go on or what's going to happen like in the next budget, because that's the immediate challenge. But yeah, I think probably just normal lobbying and politics. I don't know if it's really all that different than what would be going on, except that the stakes are higher. But I think like the battle lines, wouldn't you say, Dale, are mostly the same, or kind of what they've always been.
Do you see things that may be permanent changes from this experience, Dale?
Yeah.
Well, one thing that immediately popped into my head when you said that was something that Superintendent Height said at one of our more recent press briefings, which was say goodbye to snow days.
Yeah.
You're gonna have your laptops. Presumably, they're gonna keep them. Kids are still gonna have access to them. And instead of having a snow day, they're going to be expected to do the virtual learning thing. So that's one. But I think another thing is in the immediately in terms of what's going to happen in September. I think many of the scenarios being discussed for reasons of social distancing and transportation and all of those things might involve students not going to school 5 days a week, not being in buildings 5 days a week. And, alternating, 2 days in, 2 days out. There's other school districts are talking about this, and so is Philly, not just Philly, but school districts around the state, how that's going to work. So I think what's going to happen, at least in the short term, and it might hang on in terms of, is a combination of virtual learning and showing up in school buildings for a lot of students. And how long that will last and what form it will take, again, another thing that is up in the air. But a lot of people are putting a lot of time into thinking about this.
Yeah, and I would that I think there was some speculation or just sort of some chatter at the beginning of this well, everyone's going to go virtual, and all of a sudden we're going to be sort of rethinking the way we do school, and folks are going to realize that you don't have to do as much in-person school. Maybe you could go to a 4-day week with 1 day virtual. My gut is telling me that that's not where this is headed, because the feedback that I've heard from parents and teachers has been mostly toward the negative side, like not negative in the sense that they're mad at their teachers. I think they think teachers are trying their best, but that this has been a frustrating experience, and that they're almost more appreciative of in-person school and the things that in-person school provides, not least of which is basically someone to watch after your kids while you go to work. And so I haven't sensed like that this is creating a real hunger for more virtual education. We have a teacher joining us later. I'll be very interested to hear what he thinks about this. But I haven't gotten the sense that this is leading us towards some sort of sea change. And in some ways you can imagine it backfiring a little bit, because instead of sort of a gradual transition to virtual education, everyone kind of got thrown in the deep end of the pool, not totally prepared. And I've sensed a little bit of a backlash, honestly. And that doesn't mean that virtual education is dead, but I just think that there is from a lot of folks, a real appreciation for what in-person school provides, not just educationally, but societally. And that it's really, really, really hard to replace. And so I don't get a sense that this is going to, at least in the very, very short term, completely reorient our expectations for school.
To that point, is there anyone keeping data on how much learning is happening in real time, as opposed to students kind of on their own after hours doing schoolwork?
So this is an interesting question. So we're going to get some updates actually later today from the school district about participation. But the data that we have, that I have seen, is pretty sparse, pretty weak. It's more linked to like percentage of students who log on in a given day or complete an assignment. It's really not a proxy for learning. It's not a deep proxy for learning. And that's always hard to measure. I mean, in normal times anyways. There's been some surveys out there of teachers, for instance, and how sort of do they get a sense of students learning more or less, and they tend to think that students are learning less, but it's hard to get a hold on this. I mean, that's like a poll. That's is that really the complete picture? maybe it gives you a glimpse, but it's hard to say. Maybe Dale could correct me. I haven't seen a lot of like really great data on how this is working. I think the focus has been to make it, just like get something up and running, but not necessarily to measure it and in like a comprehensive way.
Well, one thing that happened is that they didn't give tests this year, and those are the standardized tests. A lot of people don't like them, but that's the closest thing to measurement, or the easiest thing to measure. So that hasn't been given out this year. The other thing is that not only in Philly but all over, there was this big debate over grading and how to grade students. And most people, most districts, most teachers have come down on the side of, I'm concerned that they do the work, that they're safe, and that they don't regress too much. And they're not interested in, did they master this? I mean, they are interested in that, but they're not measuring and grading and stuff is not high on anybody's list right now. They just want to make sure that people are safe, that they remain connected to their school, to their teachers, and that they're healthy in the middle of the pandemic. I mean, that's what I've heard from most people. The other thing that builds a little bit on what Avi said about whether or not people are going to want to keep virtual school, or at least part-time virtual school, is that another thing that people are realizing and emphasizing is that so much of school is about relationships. The teachers and relationships with kids' relationships with each other. I was talking to a special ed teacher the other day who has a class of 6 children on the autism spectrum, and their ability to see each other on a screen, once a day is what's keeping them going, that they're seeing their friends. And so that is so much a part of school, not to mention there's good and bad sides to the socialization that happens in school, but then there's the sports and the theater and the art and all of those other things that are much, much harder to do virtually, although there's some amazing stuff online, if you've seen it, of people doing artistic things that way. But yeah, those kinds of events that require people to be together. And, the fact that graduations people are lamenting the loss of that. These meetings and friendships and milestones, you can't do that online, and so people are really starting to appreciate all this more as this goes on, and it, the time of being sort of quarantined, everybody is prolonged.
I think one of the real stories that people are becoming so much more aware of is how much teachers are so invested in students, to the point where teachers will show up in students' yards and post signs to acknowledge their graduation. That's very, that shows a deep level of dedication. I wanted to get back to this special education piece for a minute. Obviously the school districts, have a legal obligation to serve these students. And Avi, you did a story on someone who's a teacher who also has a special needs child. And, and one of the things you wrote was speech therapy has moved online. Physical therapy is off the table. The child has a limited contact with her aide. The parent has become the therapist, the aide, and the teacher, for no fault other than the fact that people cannot see each other at all. And that, the learning is really, this kind of very generic packet of stuff. What kind of options do parents with, for special education have right now?
Well, this is
let alone the teachers who are trying to serve them.
Yeah, this has been one of the subplots of the entire virtual learning experience since schools closed. And I want to rewind a little bit because the context here is important. Initially, when many schools were reluctant to do virtual education, they said it was because of equity concerns, which it was. It was because they weren't sure they could, all students could get online. But embedded within that concern was the very real thought that they could be sued under the federal special education law, because that law basically confirms certain rights for special education students. And if you sort of go online without at least, I guess, making a legitimate attempt to provide special education students, you would be in violation of federal law. And so that created a huge pause at the beginning of this. And I think it remains a problem. Essentially, the reason why that didn't become the ultimate roadblock is because the federal government said, don't let it be a roadblock. You're not allowed to let it be a roadblock. You need to go online, essentially. And so they did. But I would say, just in conversations with advocates and families, there's real concern that special education students are going to be left behind, and that the obligations schools made to students with disabilities will basically be left by the wayside because there's just so much else going on and it's hard to do and we don't have time, you know. Now, what's difficult about this topic in terms of trying to report on it is that, you know, special education is sprawling. I mean, there's so many different services that are provided. Each child with an IEP, what's called an IEP, has like their own arrangement essentially with the school district, and it's private. So it's hard to know, like, in a systematic way, are school districts living up to the promises that they made to special education students? But I think there's certainly heavy suspicion that they aren't. And I think the question is, especially as we head into next year, but maybe even starting now, whether, you know, the ultimate sort of leverage that families have is they can lodge a complaint, they can sue if the school district is not providing the services they said they were going to provide. And I think the question is, will we see lots of families start to do that? Will we see some class action lawsuits? I heard one lawyer bring that up as a possibility. I don't know. I think it's a little too early to say, but that's a huge issue. And, you know, some of it is, it's sort of split between, there are some services like occupational therapy, you know, hands-on type therapy that's just going to be difficult to do online, that we all acknowledge. But there are some things that I think a lot of families say you could try to do online to help my child access the material. And are you doing everything you can do? And I think that's where we could see real friction develop.
The kinds of words that the state has been using is like good faith effort. And you ask, what does good faith effort mean? And they really can't tell you. The other thing is something called compensatory education, which means that if students, if for some reason their IEP is not fulfilled, which stands for individualized educational plan or program, if it's not fulfilled, there's a right embedded in the law, the federal law, that they can get compensatory education, meaning that the school district has to make it up to them. And, you know, we can see a wave of this, not just in Philly, but just about in every school district, of people saying, you know, we need, you know, the therapy that we didn't get. Not only that, but, you know, there's been regression since it started and we need more. So, and the advocates are being, you know, closely watching this, understanding, you know, the uniqueness and the dilemmas that the districts are on, but very closely watching to make sure that parents and families and kids get everything that they are legally entitled to with, and I think a lot of compensatory education providing that is going to be very expensive and just add to the cost of things that the school districts are already in some degree of difficulty, because they're not likely to, their budgets are going to be decimated by this whole thing.
Yeah. Hey, Dale, I wanted to ask you about daycares, because you've done some reporting. The School Notebook has done reporting on you know, daycares, how some centers are trying to adapt and create their own kind of online curriculums, how some are providing diapers and formula to families for, you know, purchasing educational kits for kids. And obviously they talk about financial strife. Many of them are going to, you know, are dealing with very, you know, difficult challenges as well. What are you seeing in terms of, you know, support for daycares? And, you know, is there any money for that?
Well, there was a commitment by the state to daycare or early childhood ed.
Mhm.
Is very complex. It's a combination of public money and private money and individual providers and for-profit businesses and nonprofits organizations. And there's all these funding streams. There's state funding streams. There's local funding streams. There's federal funding streams. Some kids get are subsidized by two different programs, and others are private pay. And a lot of these daycare centers and early childhood education centers rely on all this money. So they did strike a deal with the state that they would be reimbursed through the end of May. And I haven't, frankly, double checked to see where all that is now, for most of the subsidies that they would get otherwise. But they still, even, a lot of them still rely on private pay. So a lot of them are trying very hard to maintain their staff. Another thing about daycare and early childhood is that those teachers and caregivers are not paid very much. Yeah. And, one of my stories, there was somebody said that, they can go work at Target, have a lot less mental and emotional investment and make as much, if not more money. And a lot of people do it. So it's a job in the society that is incredibly valuable, but totally underpaid and undervalued by the economic system. So it's going to be, most of the daycare centers and early childhood centers I talked to were working very hard to keep their staff, to keep paying their staff, because they don't want them to go on unemployment leave, find other jobs, so that they can start up again when this is over. And people say you can, resume normal life, although I still don't know how that's going to look. But, so a lot of them are still struggling, and some of them may just go out of existence because they can't make it, like any other small business. Others, but it's going to be a huge issue because so many people depend on them for, so that they can go to work in their essential jobs. So, so right now, I think the early childhood and daycare industry is still going to face a lot of upheaval going back.
Thank you. So we're going to take, I think we're going to invite AJ Maida into the room now. AJ is a social studies teacher at Methacton High School, and he's also the wrestling coach. AJ?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Let's see. I think I can.
All right. It works.
I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Okay.
I can see him.
I can see
him. Okay, great. And AJ teaches high school seniors, which is especially challenging right now. So AJ, let's hear a little bit about your experience, both with distance learning, but also, dealing with high school students and, this very sudden end to their school year.
Yeah, it's mid-May and they're seniors, so you can imagine circumstances, the super high motivation level of high school seniors in May. But it's tailed off a little bit. I just would start by saying that all the things you guys have been touching on, both I kind of feel that both as a parent and a teacher. I think Methacton, where I work, was pretty well equipped. I mean, they're going to be as well equipped for this type of thing as possible. And that doesn't mean we're well equipped, but it does mean that, Dale had mentioned schools that were on a one-to-one laptop. We have, for every student from 7th to 12th grade has a Chromebook, issued by the school. And they keep that with them for 4 years or 6 years or whatever. And it's still a struggle. So having all that up and running, we have a Google license for every kid. They have an email. We have Google Classroom as a platform, an online learning platform that we all use. It's mandated by the district that we use before this, and it's been really challenging just to know. But I think the other thing is, and I think teachers do this all the time anyway. You sort of ask yourself what's really important, what was really important maybe in February has completely shifted. And I think Dale mentioned this primarily for me. You want to make sure your kids are safe, right? First thing, you want to make sure kids are safe. And then you really start to question things like, all right, what were the skills or the content that I really, really thought, was important here? And is it still important? Or are there a whole host of other things that maybe we should be worrying about right now besides the skills and the content?
And what revelations did you have about that, AJ?
I haven't had any good ones. No, I talk to my coworkers about this every day, and we always, I make the reference. I said, look, if this was Monday, December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor was bombed, what would a social studies teacher be going into class the next day and saying, well, you owe me this thing, you didn't do this assignment, or how could, I have to give you a test now, and it's Monday, December 8th, 1941. This isn't a war, but the world certainly changed for these kids. And so I think to expect the same exact thing that you were going to expect if you were in a class, and I have 130 kids or so I see a day, give or take, it's just not realistic. And it wouldn't be fair to me. And then, look, I'm a parent. I almost look at part of me trying to take some stress off of other parents too, by just changing my outlook, right?
Mm-hmm. One of the questioners asked, are we teaching valuable lessons and teaching skills? Or are we just keeping students occupied and providing structure? And what if we are failing to do either, which is how I'm feeling these days? So I'm assuming that's coming from a teacher. What have you talked about with your colleagues in that regard?
Well, it's really difficult. You guys spent some time talking about special education and how every special education student needs something individualized. You could make that right now for every single kid. You could make that argument before. One of the hardest things to know is what's going on in every kid's life out at home, right? Mm-hmm. You look at the news and you see the unemployment rate has skyrocketed. Well, maybe I had a class full of kids whose parents had good jobs and they were gainfully employed, and that was 2 months ago, but now they're not, right? And so maybe I'm asking something of a student whose whole world has just shifted. And so those are the kinds of conversations we're having. I don't have any good answers. But to that questioner's point, I think right now schools are trying to get to June without doing harm to kids. Mm-hmm. They'll spend the summer, and I know we'll spend the summer. I have an in-service coming up on June 2nd where we will spend the day as a department asking those questions. What's important? How do we make sure kids are learning? How do we make sure kids are, all those things? And so we'll evaluate that as a staff, I guess, and the administration will certainly have some input in that as well.
I think that's a very good point. One of the questions we had in the chat was about, what do we consider the poor when we say poor, and wealthy when we say wealthy? And things have changed, I think, for everyone. I mean, we understand some of this is about a tax base, and some of this is about whether, we're going to be able to, have the financial means to be able to recover. But some of this also is kind of an assumption that we have, about Philadelphia versus the suburbs, mm-hmm. And times are tough everywhere right now. Mm-hmm. AJ, you're dealing with seniors. Yeah. Are you aside from senioritis, I'm sure this has been kind of a very difficult sort of end to their high school careers as well. What are you hearing, and how are they doing emotionally with that? It's funny. I have a couple of emails from students who will even say in their email, I can't believe I'm emailing you this. I really miss being in school. I need to know something about an assignment. They'll always start it with like, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I actually miss school. Yeah. And then you have other students who have, they're sort of checked out and, hey, I'm getting you this assignment and I know it's 3 weeks late, but take it anyway. And I got to be honest, almost 100% of the time, the answer is yes, because again, what's the point? What are we really trying to do? You have to be really flexible, I think, right now, because so much
just changed for these guys. So I'm sort of hearing the whole spectrum. Some people that are saying, oh, I can't believe I'm missing this. I hated it when I was there, or I couldn't wait to get out the door, and now I wish I was sitting in a classroom.
Yeah.
And you have other guys who are, they're look, I teach the majority of students. I teach the vast majority of students. I teach over 90% are going to a 4-year school next year, which is, something that's really unique. And those students they were talking to their roommates next year on Facebook in April or in March, right? Yeah. And so now here we are, and it's mid-May, and you can imagine where the mindset is.
Well, but they also don't know if they're going to be going to university in September, right?
Right. It is a good point.
Yeah, when we look in California, for example, has already made a decision about that, and so a lot of students I think deposits for colleges due about now.
Sure.
The usual acceptance into university that has changed as well.
Mm-hmm.
My question, I think, for all of you right now is just, do you think schools are going to open again in September? And on top of that, we tend to think of school in terms of buildings and public spaces, which, will also have its limitations. What do you hear about that? Who are you talking to, and what can we anticipate?
Well, I'll try to tackle this initially and say that I think the political pressure is on the side of let's get kids back in school in some form by late August, early September. Now, all it sounds like suggestions.
Avi, can I just interrupt for just a second? So if you're not talking, please go on mute so that we're not catching the background noise. Go ahead, Avi. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the direction of things right now. But I also get a strong sense from talking to experts that it will look somewhat different when we do return. Some of this is going to depend on the type of district you're in, whether it's rural, suburban, urban. So population density is going to matter in these conversations. It's certainly going to matter how much testing we have at that point, how much contact tracing we have at that point. And it's certainly also going to matter, what are what's the state of the virus, right? Like, we don't really know. But I think all the political pressure is lining up towards a return to school. And here in Pennsylvania, the Secretary of Education recently said, initially, I'm not totally sure if we're going to go back in the fall, and almost got his head bitten off and immediately backtracked from that, to give you a sense of the amount of pressure that's on this. But I have read proposals and memos that almost blow my mind with the types of interventions we're talking about to sort of reopen schools. Everything from rotating schedules, hybrid schedules, to teachers wearing face visors. I don't know how AJ would feel about that. I've seen things about all the windows being open all the time to the extent that that's possible, doors being open to create cross flow and circulation, and rampant testing, and also things like making sure even if a student has the sniffles, they don't go to school that day. So symptom surveillance. I mean, it is so hard to predict at this point which of these things are in the sci-fi realm and which of these things are really going to happen. But I think it's fair to say that it's going to look a little bit different, and this is going to be a scientifically and politically fraught conversation for the next few months.
Yeah, and that's we're seeing that tussle played out most certainly everywhere, right? At the national level, state level, everywhere. Dale, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think what Avi said is true. There's all these scenarios that it's hard for us to imagine now working. I hear that one of the bigger issues is the whole transportation issue. 70% of the students who go to school in Philadelphia schools travel by SEPTA. And, so what happens with public transportation, if there's some kind of rules about how many people can be on a train car at once, that's going to mean that the schools are going to have to change their schedules because the kids can't be on the train the same time all the people, going to work are. So that's a whole other issue that, the task force is apparently that is discussing this, which is the city and SEPTA and the school district. It includes all these things, and what so much does depend on where the virus is, where the guidelines that the governor has set. I mean, Philly is way far away from 50 or less, new cases a day. So it's, and then do you start the year one way and then gradually change it, or does the actual reopening cause a spike? And then you've got the flu, the ordinary garden variety flu on top of that. So it's hard to know.
Yeah, but I would just want to remind our audience that this is your time to ask questions, and so we are taking questions. If you have any you'd like me to ask the panel. So who are the people who are coming together and making this decision? I mean, is there kind of like one big secret room that, virtual room that they're talking to each other every day? I mean, we really haven't heard about, kind of where everyone is in this.
Well, I've been trying to get more information about these task forces. We're working on trying to do that. All we know so far is that there's, district people are working with the city. The other issue that is worth bringing up is, the issue of the teacher unions and the public employee unions in general, and what they are going to be requiring as a condition of returning to work. But it's not just the issue of how much they're going to get paid, and it so happens that the PFT is negotiating a new contract right now, which complicates matters. But what might be included, or what contractual demands they may make relating to requirements of their teachers to go back to work, especially teachers who might be in high risk categories, who might have health issues that will make them more susceptible. Their safety is just as important, and then if there's people who need to be laid off, and how that's going to fit in, and it's there's so many moving parts. So, and all that is, but who's in the room, and how exactly these decisions are being made, and what's being discussed specifically, and what the work plan is, there's been very little made public about that.
Well, I think, Avi, you mentioned testing, that is still the big one, right? And everyone, how does everyone get tested, all the way, the school bus driver, the cafeteria worker, teachers, students, counselors, you name it. How do we keep on top of this issue is really important.
Yeah, and that's the state of testing is going to be absolutely key. And also, they're going to be watching very, very closely. And that's not just Philadelphia, all over the country. We're looking at countries like Germany that are starting to do this with intense amounts of testing, and trying to figure out whether it's basically safe to open schools. Also, we're still learning a lot about this disease and the way it's transmitted. And one of the things that seems to be emerging is that respiratory transmission, so droplet, cough transmission of this disease among children might actually be quite low. The issue is that they're in buildings with adults, and they go home to adult caretakers. And so one expert told me that a lot of the precautions are really going to be around actually protecting adults in school buildings, because that's where a lot of the risk may originate. Now, again, we're going to learn a lot more about this over the next couple of months, hopefully, which may inform how all of this looks, or should inform how all of this looks. But we are still, there is actually some scientists who believe that closing schools was actually not an important part of flattening the curve here, and that reopening them is not necessarily all that problematic, because some countries did not close their schools. and seem to have done an okay job. So we're still learning all of that. And the science on this is going to evolve between now and just the beginning of the next school year, much less, 6 months, 9 months from now.
Yeah. And the protocols continue to change. I mean, I think of the early days when people were not required to wear masks, and now you can't go into many stores doing that. And imagine being in school all day long, everyone wearing a mask, right? AJ, are you nervous about safety?
I guess I haven't spent a whole lot of time dwelling on it, to be honest, because maybe that's the best way. If you just don't think about it, eventually September will get here and they'll have already figured this all out. But now the thing that I talk about with my colleagues a lot are just in a high school the size of Methacton, we have about 1,600 kids and 3 lunches. We just talk about the amount of times where there's a ton of kids in the same room. 100 students in the same cafeteria at the exact same time, or 1,600 kids in the hallways passing each other, or 100 kids in a gym or in an auditorium for a study hall or something like that. And so they're really the conversations we're having. I haven't given a whole lot of thought to the personal safety thing. I will say I was quarantined for 14 days because a student in a class tested positive, and so I'd already been through sort of that like lockdown 14 days thing. And maybe because nothing came of that and everyone seems to be doing okay. Maybe I just moved past that, but yeah.
You were quarantined during the school year? When school was still in session?
We went home on a Thursday. We heard that school wasn't going to be open on a Friday. That Saturday, I got a call from the principal and said, hey, somebody you teach tested positive and you have to stay quarantined and in your house for 14 days. So it's rough with a 2-year-old, but we made it work.
Oh, wow.
Could I just add one thing to that, Sandy?
Yes.
Which is that the things that AJ mentioned are exactly what I've heard, which is that the biggest logistical and epidemiological concerns are around lunch, or like feeding students, transportation, and hall passage. And so there have been proposals that perhaps lunch should be done in classrooms with box lunch, that students are not going, and that teachers should change classes instead of students, because that minimizes the amount of traffic flow in hallways. Now, I don't know if we'll be able to pull all that off, but those are the 3 areas: transportation, lunch, and I'm having my Rick Perry moment. What was the third one? The
Department of Energy. No, hall passing.
Hall passes.
Hall passage are the 3 big areas.
Yeah. Lori in our chat room suggests task forces that are formed of a cross section of educators, special education, regular education, AP gifted, counselors, nurses, food services, transportation, administrators. Do you have any hope that this kind of a group is being brought together to actually deal with these particular issues, or is this kind of staying at the high administrator health department level?
I don't know. I mean, as I said, they've not been very forthcoming with information about who's at the table. The superintendent says he's meeting regularly with the union. I know that the union is having their own caucuses with each other. But the degree to which, everyone is chiming in. I mean, I guess on the one hand, you have to keep it somewhat limited. On the other hand, you want as many perspectives as possible, because every day some new idea comes up and new problem arises. And so, I don't know. I don't know if Avi knows. Yeah.
No, I don't. I don't really know how involved educators are in making these decisions. I wish I knew more about it, but that's been a pretty closed door process from the get-go, and that's not just school district. I mean, at the state level too. I just don't have a great hold on it.
Yeah. One last question here. Can you tell us the difference between synchronous and asynchronous teaching online?
I think the superintendent actually brought that up this morning. I think it means teaching a whole group together, and maybe AJ knows, a whole group together, the same thing at the same time, and having kids progress at their own pace with the particular things they need. Is asynchronous.
I
I
think
think that's what it is.
I think basically envision like a synchronous lesson is a teacher like on a chat like this with all the students in a video chat, almost like an online classroom, whereas asynchronous would be something more along the lines of the teacher produces a video that you can view at your own leisure or assigns something that you can complete by a certain date, but is not talking to all the students at once and interacting with them back and forth. That's like, I think just like a rough definition. But yeah, it's one of those terms where like all learning, right? One of these like this like social distancing, synchronous, async, all these new terms we're having to grapple with.
Yep. Well, I see we're at 5 o'clock now. I wanted to thank you, Avi, Dale, and AJ for joining us today, and for all of you who attended this chat. You know, I always say this, how much I appreciate particularly the members for WHYY who make events like this possible for us. You know, we have a support button somewhere up here. So if anyone wants to support WHYY, we appreciate that as well. We know you have tons more questions and also suggestions of stories that we should be covering, things we should be looking at. And so we want to continue to hear from you. So please share with us any of your thoughts post this conversation, and we look forward to the next conversation. Thank you again.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks.